UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced a public inquiry into the murder of 3 schoolgirls at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport last summer. After the violent attack, riots erupted across the UK, with some social media posts wrongly claiming that the knifeman, who was born in Cardiff, was actually an asylum seeker. On Monday, 18-year-old Axel Rudakubana pleaded guilty to stabbing the girls last July. In the wake of his plea, it emerged he'd had contact with a range of different state agencies throughout his teenage years, including the police, social services and mental health services. Well, speaking in Downing Street in the last few moments, Keir Starmer said the perpetrator was referred to a prevent programme on 3 occasions, but on each occasion the judgment that he did not meet the threshold for intervention was wrong. Mr Starmer said the tragedy must be a line in the sand for Britain and that the attack in Southport was senseless and barbaric. Well, let's have a listen back to more of what the Prime Minister had to say.
The responsibility for this barbaric act lies, as it always does, with the vile individual who carried it out. But that is no comfort. And more importantly, it is no excuse. And so, as part of the inquiry launched by the Home Secretary yesterday, I will not let any institution of the state deflect from their failure. Failure which, in this case, frankly, leaps off the page. For example, the perpetrator was referred to the prevent programme on 3 separate occasions. In 2019, once, and in 2021, twice. Yet on each of these occasions, a judgment was made that he did not meet the threshold for intervention. A judgment that was clearly wrong and which failed those families. And I acknowledge that here today. Throughout this case, to this point, we have only been focused on justice. If this trial had collapsed because I or anyone else had revealed crucial details while the police were investigating, while the case was being built, while we were awaiting a verdict, then the vile individual who committed these crimes would have walked away a free man. The prospect of justice destroyed for the victims and their families. I would never do that. And nobody would ever forgive me if I had. That is why the law of this country forbade me or anyone else from disclosing details sooner. Nonetheless, it is now time for those questions. And the first of those is whether this was a terrorist attack. The blunt truth here is that this case is a sign Britain now faces a new threat. Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety, sometimes inspired by traditional terrorist groups, but fixated on that extreme violence, seemingly for its own sake. Now, it may well be that people like this are harder to spot, but we can't shrug our shoulders and accept that. We can't have a national security system that fails to tackle people who are a danger to our values, our security, our children.
Keir Starmer speaking just a few moments ago at Downing Street. Well, let's take a look at the background to this case. Our correspondent Danny Savage has more.
An attack on young children attending a summer holiday dance class on an ordinary street in an ordinary town. Some of the girls fled, terrified, into this man's home.
He ran across to me, said of being stabbed, thinking I'm going to die. So I just took them all in the house, locked the door, and I run back over there to see what I could do.
These are the children who died. BB King was 6 years old, Elsie Dot Stankham was 7, Alice Aguiar was 9. Yesterday, Axel Rudakubana pleaded guilty to their murders. He also admitted attempting to murder 10 other people, including 8 children, producing a biological toxin ricin and possessing terrorist materials. Rudakubana's trial should have started today, but because he changed his pleas yesterday, no jury will be sworn in. He will be sentenced on Thursday. He seemed to be destined for better things as a child. This is him dressed as Doctor Who in a Children in Need promotion in 2018.
It's that time of year again!
The charity has since said it has no affiliation with him. He called Childline several times as a young teenager who went to school here, eventually saying he was going to take a knife into lessons due to racial bullying. This is one incident which led to him being expelled. This man was a parent at the school.
My daughter had witnessed him chasing a kid with a hockey stick outside a maths class through one of the corridors, and it was apparently well known to her and her friends and to the school that he had a kill list.
Several times before the attack, he was referred to the government's counter-terrorism prevent programme over his general obsession with violence. With this in mind, the Home Secretary is pledging reforms to the prevent programme, and she has announced a public inquiry into the attack. In a statement, she said, "It is essential that the families and the people of Southport can get answers about how this terrible attack could take place and about why this happened to their children." Southport, though, is still trying to recover from what Rudakubana did.
I'm pleased that he's actually admitted that he's done it, so that it's not putting the family through more grief, and hopefully he'll get the sentences that he deserves.
My little boy was frightened, weren't you, of going out in the street, things, so yeah, it's had a lot of impact on the town.
All eyes will be on the sentencing hearing later in the week. Danny Savage, BBC News.
Well, let's go straight to Downing Street and join our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Henry, Sir Keir Starmer has just wrapped up speaking. Just remind us some of the main points of what he said just then.
I should just explain, by the way, you might see some cabinet ministers going in behind me. There's a cabinet meeting taking place very shortly now. That was actually Attorney General Lord Hermer, so he'll have a lot to do with this, and I'm sure the cabinet will be reflecting on what the Prime Minister said in his speech this morning. And what the Prime Minister said was pretty significant. I think this was one of the big moments of his 6 or so months in Downing Street so far, because he started with addressing the horrific, brutal, he called them, murders committed by Axel Rudakubana, to which he pleaded guilty in Liverpool yesterday. But then he broadened it out much more. He talked about the changing nature of terrorism. He said that where once you might have had terrorist activities committed by people with a clear allegiance to a terrorist group, like Al-Qaeda, for example, he said that now you have loners, misfits, young men in their bedrooms, and he questioned whether the kind of legal architecture of our state has kept pace with that. He announced that Lord Anderson KC, who's previously been an independent advisor to the government on terrorist legislation, is going to look at the prevent counter-terrorism system, which, as we now know, failed to pick up Axel Rudakubana after he was referred. But then he talked much more broadly about the changing nature of society, talked about how too many people have fallen into parallel lives. He talked about rights and obligations which people might previously have owed to each other fraying. So this was the Prime Minister promising not only that he will deal with the specific things that have come out in this case, in this trial, but actually more broadly talking about how he wanted to use those to address what he sees as failings in British society.
Failings, and this inquiry, what form will it take?
Well, it's going to be a public inquiry, and that actually has quite specific meanings in the UK. Public inquiry with a capital I, there's a piece of legislation called the Inquiries Act, which means that that will probably take some time, that there will be probably a judge appointed to chair it, there will be legal counsel appointed to represent various people involved, to cross-examine people. It will be formal. But what I think is almost more important is what questions it is geared up to address. Is it going to look at the failings from the various public institutions, or what Keir Starmer clearly at this point believes to be failings? He said they leapt off the page, these failings, from various public authorities to whom Axel Rudakubana was referred. I think clearly it's going to do that. But will it also look at some of the other things that Keir Starmer touched on in this speech? I don't know yet, but I wonder if it will look at some of those bigger questions about what terrorism means these days, about the ways in which Britain's various counter-terrorist measures haven't caught up with that. The Prime Minister also talked about the internet and the availability of things which might inspire terrorists on the internet, on social media sites. I don't know if public inquiry can look at that, probably not, but clearly the Prime Minister believes that that is at the heart of all of this as well.
Indeed, Henry Zeffman, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on that developing story. There is more on what the Prime Minister said on the BBC News website. We are running a live page and you can, of course, see more on there. Well, let's stay with that story and speak to our correspondent Eunice Muller, who is in Southport. Eunice, what's been the reaction and what's likely to be some of the questions people will be asking up there now that this inquiry has officially been announced?
The murders of the 3 young children shocked the country. We had those riots in the towns and cities, but more than anything else, this town recognises the pain and the anguish of the families of the 3 young children, the other victims, and what Axel Rudakubana did, not only to those families and victims, but also to the reputation of this seaside resort. And so they have their own questions. And they will have been listening to those comments made by the Prime Minister today about what will happen going forward, and they'll have their own questions. Hopefully they feel they'll get some of the answers from the public inquiry which has been announced into what went wrong, those failings, and why he wasn't identified as a terrible risk and as dangerous before the attacks of the summer of last year. Failings from a number of different agencies. We know he was known to police, the youth justice system, social services and mental health services. But despite that, he wasn't identified as a risk. And of course, we've also got those 3 referrals to the government's counter-terrorism prevent scheme. And again, he wasn't identified as dangerous, and that will be of concern to a lot of people here. Now, the town's MP has said that people are feeling quite emotional at the moment. Not many people were expecting Axel Rudakubana to plead guilty like he did yesterday. In fact, he hadn't spoken really before then, so that's come as a surprise. But what many people are now hoping and are looking forward to in some way is Thursday, when he will be given that sentence, and they'll be hoping, of course, that justice will be done for the families and the victims of Axel Rudakubana.
OK, Eunice Muller in Southport, thank you very much for the moment. Well, Eunice mentioned the town's MP. Let's speak to him, the Labour MP for Southport, Patrick Hurley. Welcome to BBC News. I'd like to get your thoughts and reaction to what the Prime Minister's just said.
I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister has so forcefully got a grip of this issue. For too long, we've been unable to speak at risk of prejudice in the trial. I was very clear back on the 29th of July and in the weeks and months afterwards that any speculation as to the motives or the background of the murderer could have risked the trial collapsing. I was imploring people, please do not go on social media and post your thoughts, because the families deserved justice, and we're now at the stage where the families and the community is starting to receive justice. The sentencing will be taking place on Thursday, and that's the next stage in the process. But I'm really pleased that now that the Prime Minister is at liberty to be able to make these plans and set this inquiry in train, that he's done so at pace. I am very clear that the failures of the Prevent programme specifically, but other agencies and other arms of the state more generally, need to be investigated. The inquiry needs to be no holds barred and make sure that we get to the root causes of why this murderer, this vile individual, as the Prime Minister said, was free to commit his acts of murder, and make sure that that never happens again.
I want to ask you, you mentioned the Prevent programme, and there's been lots of questions about the fact that there'd been a number of referrals. This is supposed to be a flagship anti-terror programme from the government. Do you think it's time for it to be scrapped then? What's your take on that?
It certainly needs to be reformed and be brought up to date. The threat from extremism is not maybe as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. The threat from extremism is much more distributed and non-organisational in the mid-2020s. We have people who are actively self-radicalising online. This isn't just the murderer who pleaded guilty yesterday, but these are other people who, there's a kind of a parallel issue with some of the rioters that we saw back in the summer, who themselves seem to have self-radicalised through the internet, through social media, finding other like-minded individuals without necessarily being part of a large formalised organisation or institution. And I don't think that Prevent specifically, but that law enforcement and social services more generally have yet got to grips with the fact that that's the changing nature of the threat to the UK, and we need to make sure that, as well as the larger, more kind of well-known terror threats, that we also, as a country, make sure that we don't let people like Rudakubana slip through our fingers again, because the last thing I want to see.
And just briefly on that, Mr Hurley, because you did sit before you entered Parliament on Liverpool Council as well, do you think that the Council has questions to answer as well? Because there were lots of different agencies who came into contact with Mr Rudakubana.
Yeah, so West Lancs Borough Council, where Axel Rudakubana lived, obviously there are questions to answer there around social services. There are obviously questions around adolescent mental health services as well. The Prime Minister was clear that although we can seek to blame one aspect of what government does, whether it's immigration or whether it was funding cuts over many years, I think these answers only point to a part of the jigsaw. We need to link up and we need to join the dots almost to make sure that every single aspect of what went wrong over the past 5 years, from the first contact point that Rudakubana had with Prevent back in 2019. So this was 6 years ago. And over the course of the 5-6 years, we need to make sure that why at so many opportunities he wasn't stopped, he wasn't identified at the right level of risk, and why he was free to murder back in the summer.